Thanks everybody for coming here this evening, and it's a great pleasure to be in conversation with Professor Richard English from Queen's University Belfast. I think normally when we do these events in a university, I will do a very long kind of academic introduction of all the wonderful books and articles and everything that Richard has achieved.
I think you should.
Yeah, okay. I believe it's, I think it's fair to say that anybody who studies terrorism and political violence will know Richard's work. And I think it's fair to say also, especially his book, Does Terrorism Work?, was a go-to book that I went to when I was studying the subject. And it's a book which is equally as relevant today as it ever was. And I think, to me, I think it's a great pleasure that Richard can join us this evening. And the way we anticipate the format for today is we will engage in a conversation for about 20 minutes. We will then invite some reflections and questions from the audience. And then we will have the opportunity just to have an informal meeting with one another. There are so many other brilliant academics in the room as well, which is also the delight to be part of this. And I think one thing we've been discussing today more than ever is that violence demands a conversation, and a difficult conversation, especially when it comes to the question of disappearance, which will be the focus for this evening. And it's also wonderful to be able to hold this conversation in this particular setting, surrounded by such wonderful art from Chantal as well. So I think to start, Richard, I think maybe building off from what we were discussing earlier and the importance of biography, and biography in terms of how we all come to the kinds of questions and concerns that we deal with. You're renowned, especially for your work on terrorism, and terrorism, especially in Northern Ireland, which we know has a particular relationship to disappearance as well. But can you tell us your own journey into, first of all, the question of terrorism and then to disappearance?
Well, thank you, and thanks for the gracious comment. I'm looking forward enormously to the conversation. I love the dialogue on these occasions, so every one of you, questions, comments, I'm looking forward to those. There's a Bristol dimension to it, and there's a Belfast dimension to it for me. I went to school in Bristol. I'm delighted to say that my history teacher is in the room, Mr. Stephen Ryan. For a long time, I've wanted to have the public opportunity to thank the best teacher I ever had for getting me involved in history, and I would like to say that to Steve now. He always tried to encourage us to think incredibly critically and deeply about the past and about how that informed political considerations. Mm-hmm. And that had a huge influence on me as a left-leaning child in Bristol as a kid. Went to university and became fascinated with the tension between Marxism and nationalism, which at that stage was a really big tension if you were on the left, because nationalism was more of a problem for Marxism than many observed. And I looked for a case study. I'd been born in Belfast, my mum was from Belfast, and so I looked for a case study and found the left wing of the IRA and started studying that. So I got into this partly through a fascination with history as the way of thinking about contemporary problems, but then at university thinking about a tension between Marxism and nationalism as big phenomena. And terrorism was a kind of symptom of that. In a way, terrorism was a symptom of the things that really mattered most about nationalisms, about, in the Irish case, rival nationalisms, in the Irish case, rival religiously fueled nationalisms. I went and did a PhD on the subject, got a job in Northern Ireland, and then nothing's ever entirely planned. I just fell in love with the idea of working on it and became really hooked on the idea of working on it in Belfast, which was an amazing place to study these things because everything was right in front of you, because the students and the people you met, you could meet people who'd been involved on all sides in a wonderful city, but a city that was going through trauma still when I went there. So there was a history dimension, there was a schoolboy discovering history, there was a student at university wanting to think about major phenomena and violence as a symptom of it. That became an interest, initially working on the IRA. And then again, world events transform things. When I was writing a book on the IRA decided to end what they called their armed struggle. And so then when the planes flew into the towers in 2001 and the whole world became interested in how does terrorism come to an end, then the Irish story was a story which had some kind of global resonances, and I moved from writing books about Irish nationalism and political violence to writing books about terrorism, like the one you kindly mentioned, Does Terrorism Work?, which have an Irish chapter, but which are comparative histories. So while I'd like to think, Brad, that I had it all planned out, it was actually, no, I've been born in Belfast because of my mum being from Northern Ireland. I got interested in history partly through the contingency of having a brilliant teacher. I was a left-leaning person trying to come to terms with left-wing politics and nationalism. got hooked on the Irish case, and then I've lived in Ireland most of my life since then. I've been based in Ireland, and tragically, the events of the last few weeks have shown that terrorism and responses to terrorism still have a capacity not only to destroy many people's lives, but to shape politics well beyond the incidents that are actually occurring. So it remains an issue of really sharp-edged, charged importance, I think, for all of us. And I would still stick to what I discovered at school, which is that I think we have to think about these things historically if we're going to take seriously how we respond to the present.
Well, I think it's beautiful so you can acknowledge the intellectual debt into your teacher and also to history. And I'm ever mindful, all violence has a history, and it doesn't simply fall from the skies. And what is it you think about the present moment? Stuart Hall would call the historical conjuncture. What is it about this present moment that you think demands a better appreciation of the histories of violence? And especially, I'm thinking in terms of the histories of violence linked to strategies around interstate conflict, but also the violence of disappearance linked to that.
So there are at least 3 brilliant questions in there, and I'll try and do justice to them if I can. I think the present moment, we've seen all sorts of deliberately terrorizing political violence in recent years, some of it non-state, some of it state. Some of the violence in the Ukraine invasion by Russia was deliberately terrorizing violence with an attempt to try to have an effect beyond the direct victims, which is one of the elements of terroristic violence. And the title of tonight is Terrorisms, Violence and Disappearance, and I think there are terrorisms, some non-state, some state. I think partly it's also, Brad, about how we react to non-state terrorism changes the world far more than the terrorism itself. So how the reactions to the assassination in 1914, which was the trigger for the cataclysm of the First World War, the reactions to 9/11, that atrocity was callous and appalling, but it was contingent state reactions that transformed the world far more. And similarly, the current crisis in Israel-Palestine is one where it seems to me we don't know how the future is going to go on that, but it does seem to me that at the moment there's a risk of escalation well beyond Israel-Palestine itself. What does that mean in terms of disappearance? I mean, tragically so much. I mean, terrorism clearly involves the direct disappearing of precious life. In many cases, in terms of numbers, quite limited in Northern Ireland, but during the Northern Ireland Troubles, there were disappearances of people, as you know, had traumatic effects, appalling effects on those related to and close to the victims. But in some ways also there are disappearances in terms of the populations and the victims that we don't think about. So, for example, in the histories of the last couple of decades, in the West, we've been more concerned with the Western victims of anti-Western jihadist violence, whereas most of the victims of ISIS were Muslims in the Middle East, not in the West. And while every life is equally precious, Western or wherever in the world, it seems to me that we sometimes have silences of what we attend to. My sense is that we can't attend to the politics properly unless we're listening honestly and openly to the loss which is there in the disappearances. So there are direct disappearances of people, but then there is the denial of people almost having existed at all and having had that history of violence done to them. But there are also ways in which we're all comfortable with silences of other kinds of people, and I think that's part of the big problem with the Middle East at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's been a broad silence around disappearance generally, and I think that's a problem. But as you were speaking, I was kind of reminded, first of all, obviously the complexities in the Middle East. And on the one hand, I think I can kind of understand the visceral reaction within the state of Israel to the kidnapping of people, given the history of kidnapping during the Holocaust and the systematic attempt at disappearing populations. But as you say, also the reaction can actually mitigate further the very cause that gives rise to this. But I was also thinking about the violence then of groups such as ISIS as well, where when we find one of the evident symbolic realities of disappearance is the reappearance of mass graves. And we think of the mass grave with ISIS and how many of the bodies discovered in those were Muslim populations. So that kind of constant violence of disappearance and the reappearance of bodies still seems to be something we as a society get deeply emotional about, but find it very difficult to talk about.
I think we do, and I think that's partly why this exhibition is an incredibly evocative way of trying to stimulate emotional responses which are appropriately sharp-edged, actually, and I think that's a really important thing. It's very comfortable to forget about the disappeared. In some of the cases globally, in Mexico, for example, in Argentina, the scale of loss has been so vast that it's almost too painful to think about openly. And yet, unless we do, I think we're just laying foundations for future trauma in ways that will blow back at all of us, I think. I suppose it's also about some notion that honesty about these painful things requires that we have a dialogue where we listen to people we disagree with. And we've not been particularly good at that in recent times. We've resisted the idea that if people have very strong disagreement about sharp-edged things, the other person might have a point, and you start with that. I think we're more comfortable assuming that, you know, if you're wrong, I'm right, and that's all I need to know about the situation. In some of the responses to the Israel-Palestine crisis at the moment, we've seen that again. I think where there's been a sense of people, you know, in Northern Ireland, everything is refracted through the division within Northern Ireland politics. So there are, again, a plethora of Palestinian flags in some areas and Israeli flags in other areas. And there's a sort of bifurcation, almost an identification, as if it's automatically one side that's right and the other side that's wrong. You mentioned complexity, Brad. I think these things are always going to be grey and messy rather than clear-cut. And I think some notion that dialogue and ways of trying to be honest about the terrible suffering involved in what you're talking about, you know, the disappearance of people in itself directly awful, but then not being able to grieve, not knowing, you know, the opacity of what happened to people, not knowing what happened, having a lot of disinformation about what happened to people. On a bigger scale still, when it's state actors doing it than non-state actors, but in both cases horrific. I suppose what I like is the idea of dialogue, and that has risks with it because you always have the possibility that there'll be something challenging there. But I think unless we do have proper dialogue about things in relation to disappearance, in relation to terrorism, but in relation to much else, we weaken society for all of us, in my view.
I'm thinking about also the scale of disappearances, and when we think of, like, you know, Colombia, you know, 100,000, Mexico, 100,000 since 2006, and then we look at Ireland, and the numbers seem insignificant compared, but it's never insignificant. And I think then if you look at the context of Ireland, you know, we're talking about a handful of people, or, you know, 20 people disappeared. But even that seems to be such a sticking point in finally resolving the peace process there. So if it has that much of a monumental significance, when it's that a small amount of people, I'm trying to think, you know, relating that to then 100,000 people. You know, what do you think we can draw from the Irish experience in the context of disappearance, and how can that maybe speak out to the broader circumstances as well? That's
a great question. I mean, I think one thing is that, well, one positive suggestion springs to mind and one more negative point. The positive suggestion is that the Independent Commission looking at trying to recover the disappeared, which, as you say, was a small number. Most of the bodies have now been recovered, and most of the people were disappeared by the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. The Independent Commission that looked at locating victims' remains did build good relations with the former movement the movement that had formerly done it. So there was a kind of pragmatism of building trust in terms of trying to find not an assuaging of the awfulness, but at least some progress. If you could locate the bodies' remains, if you could have some kind of closure there, at least it was progress. But that took a kind of practical step. And some of the people involved in the practical work there, I know, have been engaged with people in Colombia, have been engaged with people elsewhere. And although it's on a much bigger scale, there might be elements of that which I think are positive in terms of the practicalities. It doesn't take away the loss, but it in some ways is at least some progress where you know what happened to your loved one, and there can be some sense of bringing the story to its appropriate point. The negative thing is that in Northern Ireland, while we have a tremendously successful peace process in terms of the ending of almost all of the violence, which has been an amazing achievement. I mean, the time I've lived in Belfast since my wife and I moved there in the late 80s, and I've been based there most of the time since. Belfast has transformed in terms of the levels of lethal violence, but it's a society that's entirely divided. Mm-hmm. So there's been a kind of sullen peace without reconciliation. And some of the arguments around the disappeared have been part of that history war as well. In other words, you know, trying to arraign the organisation that did the murders, trying to arraign particular individuals involved with it. So one of the lessons we might think about is the extent, and I'd be interested in people's views on this, the extent to which reconciliation is or is not a constituent and necessary part of peace. I mean, some people argue that it is. In Northern Ireland, broadly speaking, we've got peace without reconciliation. The peace is still a huge achievement. And in some ways, sometimes when I'm giving lectures on terrorism around the world, and I talk about this, people say, well, peace without reconciliation would be great here because we don't have either. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, there might be a modulation of what you expect. When the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, There was a sense of it being epochal, but there were some unrealistic expectations about it maybe having brought things to an end, whereas it had brought things to a much less bloodstained level of a conflict that was still ongoing about legitimacy. So there may be aspects of what we think it's realistic to expect which might be informed by the Irish case too. One of the things that's been very valuable about the engagements, and when there are experts here who've worked on Colombia, for example, is the ways in which different peace processes which have their own contingencies can learn from each other. And I think some of the people involved in the various places have been very constructive in saying, well, this is a challenge we've faced, but this is what we did. Or how did you deal with this question around ex-competence? How have you dealt with legacy? How have you dealt with ex-prisoners? How have you dealt with commemoration? I mean, in Belfast, there's very little commemoration of the Troubles. Because once you start saying we're going to commemorate this victim, people say, well, that victim wasn't really as much of a victim as this victim. So how do you get that kind of... And so some of those questions, although they're, as you say, in terms of the scale of loss in Northern Ireland, it's smaller. In a way, it is it's world historical conflict on that smaller scale, which may have family resemblances with some of the other conflicts you're alluding to.
Well, I'm just mindful that I don't want to dominate all the questions to you, so I will just ask you one more question before I think we can open up to questions in the room. And you've talked about the way in which, of course, the fraught piece or the fragile piece that exists in Northern Ireland. And what is it then, do you think, that still is the most significant challenge in Northern Ireland, especially around conversations with disappearances, and especially different advocacy groups, and how does that cause still ongoing tensions or maybe irresolvable dilemmas in society?
It's a difficult question. I mean, one thing is that there isn't agreement in Northern Ireland about why the Troubles started, why they endured, why they ended, and what should happen next. So on all of the big questions, there's still a very, very strong disagreement on that. So when you throw into the mix the atrocity of disappearance, the taking of someone's life, the denial of what had actually happened to them in a number of cases, the impossibility of people being able to grieve properly, this is going on for decades. There's a sense in which some people simply want to arraign the villains and say, you did this terrible thing and you should be made to pay for it. There are other people who want to get some practical gestures which move things forward for the families. There are other people who simply want to forget and say, let's leave the past. And the legacy has been a huge problem in Northern Ireland. As you know, there's been controversial UK legislation to deal with legacy in Northern Ireland, which has been largely opposed by victims groups in Northern Ireland. I suppose where I think we have to deal with the problem is we need to have a greater sense that one of the things intuitions which you might derive from the Northern Ireland conflict is the ineffectiveness of non-compromise. The pursuit of sheer victory is one of the things which prolonged the conflict, one of the things which made peace more difficult. And it seems to me in a lot of these cases what we need to do is recognise that there may be things which, though flawed, though messy, though partial, are necessary, even though they're not comforting for whichever side it is. So if you're broadly sympathetic to the Irish Republican movement or broadly very antagonistic to the Irish Republican movement, there'll be aspects of a better future for Northern Ireland, for Ireland, for these islands, which will necessarily involve some things that are very uncomfortable. That's been very difficult, and things remain very divided. We still don't have a government in Northern Ireland. We still have very divided views about the past and the present and the future. On the other hand, I think one of the lessons of the 1990s peace process in Northern Ireland was that people did build up some kind of creative relationship of trust between former adversaries in ways that were gradual, gentle, but eventually fluctuated into an unexpected peace. I remember in the early 1990s when the Israel-Palestine peace process was going well and the Northern Ireland peace process was going very badly, people were giving lectures saying, this is why peace will happen in Israel, but it could never happen here in Northern Ireland, right? And then as Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief negotiator for the peace negotiations in the 90s, now says, people used to say it's impossible, and now they say it was always inevitable in Northern Ireland, it was always going to happen there. And he said, didn't feel like that, Richard, didn't feel like that. I think in some ways, hope in that is that even bleak situations like Israel-Palestine at the moment needn't be entirely bleak long term. There is a contingency to it. And in 1993, if you'd been saying which of these peace processes will go better, people would have said Israel. And they say it's never going to happen in Belfast because of this and this. And actually now they say it was always going to happen in Northern Ireland. Let's almost forget about the conflict. Couldn't happen in Israel. And actually I think that one of the things which my history teacher stressed when we were at school, and I think this is one of the big points about history, is it's contingent, not inevitable. And that's why I think how we respond to terrorism and how we respond to disappearances and the legacy of them, it's the response to it that's going to really determine the future.
I'm going to completely use my sovereign privilege and ask you one more question, actually, because I've just realised there's something on this which is so important from what you said. One of the things that also strikes me is the way in which the strategy of disappearance actually seems more possible in an age of digitalization, which is difficult to get our heads around. But actually, in the context of Mexico, you know, the massive increase in disappearance there corresponds with the rise of the surveillance state and digital technologies and tracking and surveillance. And I'm just wondering also, you know, as you were talking about, you talk about the lack of compromise, the lack of ability to see the world from the position of the other. I'm thinking about then the situation in Ireland or indeed in Israel, and how the advent of social media, rather than connecting people, might actually be another one of the driving causes behind a new world of non-compromise. And I'm wondering how you think that's playing out in Ireland, whether there is a younger generation who are becoming more entrenched in an echo chamber, which is actually causing a new chapter in the Troubles.
It's a very hard question to answer. I mean, there have been people who've speculated, including some people from the media, had Twitter existed in the 1990s, would the Belfast Good Friday Agreement have happened? You know, if people had been able to iPhone something and then put something on Instagram, would it have been as easy to get things? It wasn't easy, but would it have been possible? And it's a question to which I don't have a certain answer. I think it might have been more difficult. There are things which are, there is an acceleration of centrifugal polarization, which technology can be used for if we want it to, and I think that's often happened. Where I think it's also important is that, I mean, I was the last person on the planet to buy a mobile phone, so I'm, you know, but even I have one now. But I think that there are ways in which you can much more easily self-segment with seemingly whole worlds of people through social media. So you don't have to encounter the disagreement which I'm talking about as being necessary. Universities, as we both know, Brad, have not been entirely wonderful at dealing with dialogue in recent times, and I think that somehow it seems to me that this kind of thing, where you've got people in a room, actual people, not holograms, where you've got people who actually can ask a question, and where you have to listen to the person with that kind of physicality of engagement, of conversation, is what we need more of. It's interesting that some of the people who have made billions out of tablet-based technology seem not to be keen that their kids have access to it. And I think that's an interesting truth. You know, they know what they're doing. You know, and you know, I'm not on whatever Twitter's now called. I never was on Twitter, but and I'm sure that's a failing. On the other hand, I also think that there's something about engaging in physics. There's something about having actual paintings. There's something about having actual people. There's something about having actual books. No, I say there's someone who writes them. There's something about actually having books which is a specific way of engaging with humanity. Technology can be incredibly benign, obviously. It often, you know, going back to my old left-wing self, it often gets determined disproportionately by where massive profit will go as well. And I don't think that always tends towards the irenic.
That's a good place to start the conversation. So we will invite questions, comments. Obviously, if somebody has a comment, please try to keep it succinct, but mindful of other people in the room. But does anybody have any questions for Richard you'd like to? Yeah.
Sorry, I was just wondering, especially when you were talking about Mexico and Colombia and the global south in general, how far do you think, I mean, there's a conflict in the Congo at the moment, which has taken, it's estimated to be about 6 million lives. Rwanda, Uganda, heading the M23 organisation, essentially stripping it of its what's the word? Natural resources. There we go. And it's received bare minimum coverage in comparison to conflicts like Palestine, Israel, and Ukraine. And I was wondering how far you think that the West has kind of become just ambivalent towards conflict in the global south?
It's a great question. So we were discussing this earlier today. I mean, in the literature on terrorism, one of the fascinating things is both that the overwhelming amount of scholarship that's produced on it is produced in countries where there largely isn't very much, which tend to be very rich countries, whereas the countries where there's the most high intensity of terrorist violence, where there's often quite a close intimacy of understanding of what's happening locally, which wouldn't necessarily be better scholarship, but there's something uniquely missing if you don't listen to that. So, you know, the countries where there's been most terrorism in recent decades, so if you look at, you know, Iraq, India, Peru, Colombia, you know, very minimal engagement in the big literature in terms of so we have a kind of debate amongst ourselves about what's happening somewhere else. tied in with that is the fact that we have this disgraceful capacity to ignore certain atrocities which happen on such a great scale. I mean, I think according to UN figures, every day 25,000 people die of hunger or hunger-associated disease. It's never an issue. Right? The Democratic Republic of the Congo, I mean, the violence there over recent times has dwarfed what most of the world has seen, barely in the news. During the Rwandan genocide, I was giving a lecture in the States during one of the high points of that. You couldn't find anything on the news about it at all. So I think this goes back to another kind of disappearance, that there are silences about certain kinds of loss. I mean, my approach is that every human life is equally precious, and human suffering is what we should try and prevent. I could never get elected as a politician because there's not many votes in saying that, okay? But on the other hand, it seems to me as humans, if we lose sight of that, something awful has happened. And of course, part of the desperation of some people who engage in violence, not justifying it, and not most of them, is the sense of being humiliatingly left in suffering in a way that nobody notices it at all. And one of the things that terrorist violence does do is it seizes attention. Normally doesn't achieve that which the attention is intended to produce, and is more certain to produce suffering than any political progress. But you know, the examples you give are horrific. And we're comfortable. I mean, I think, you know, if there's anyone left on the planet in a couple of 100 years, they'll look back at Western Europe at this point and they'll say, right, first of all, there's all those people dying every day, most of them black, and no one cared. Right? If you're not concerned about that, they knew they were destroying the planet through climate change. What did they do? They discussed a squabble about identity between rich West European nations. Not only that, they flew around to discuss Brexit all the time and how annoyed they were about it. What was wrong with these people? You know, cancel anything named after any of them. These people are atrocious. And there would be a good case because so what's the answer is the question. I mean, behind your question is what do we do about it? I think one thing we do about it is we have to rebalance the geographies of attention, and we have to treat every human life as being equal, and therefore we need to be much less selfish about the things we focus on. And I think all of us have a responsibility with that, with the work that you do, with the way in which you pay attention to things, with the people you vote for, with the news that you get, how you respond to the news that you get. But is it disgraceful? Yeah, I'm instinctively a pessimist. Do I think it'll get better? Not much, but I think we can always do you can only do that which you think is right to do.
Yeah. There seems to be a direct link as well between invisibility of suffering and the disappearance of humans.
Yeah,
and it's poignant. Next year is the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, and it seems like, yeah, you know.
Thank you, Richard. That was really great. I wanted to ask about, you were talking about Northern Ireland peace process and potential lessons, or I think you used the phrase like families, that you can have a comparative nature of these situations. I was wondering if you thought there's ever a time when that is a negative thing, or maybe these comparisons are made in a less positive way in terms of like outcomes that come from comparisons?
It can be. I mean, I think also comparison can be as much about difference as similarity. In other words, it could be that there are things which are just very, very different about Colombia and Northern Ireland, and that therefore the key thing is to stress the difference. I think also there is a kind of capacity to turn things into a business sometimes, so there can be here's our lessons. I mean, a lot of what happened in Northern Ireland was out of any particular group's control, and there was a sort of element of good fortune with some of it. Some of the personalities and the relationships they built up were somewhat accidental rather than produced deliberately. So I wouldn't exaggerate that. What I do think is that, I mean, increasingly I've become a kind of cross-case historian, and I think that the family resemblances between unique conflicts can still be family resemblance in a way that's significant. Can it be negative? I think it can be negative if you take the wrong lessons as well. That's the other thing. I mean, I think quite often this year, this 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, we had a massive gig in Belfast to commemorate, to some degree celebrate it. Some of the lessons that came out of it, as people presented them, seemed to me to be exaggerating the degree to which people just suddenly decided to show leadership. To which the question is, why did they suddenly decide to show leadership then, not 20 years earlier? So there are hard questions sometimes about it, but I do think cross-case comparison can be enriching. I also think, going back to the previous question, in some ways, if it forces us all to think about conflicts with which we're less intimately associated, that could be an educative thing, which is very valuable, and it can therefore be something where you can listen to, you know, in terms of disappearance, you can think about the victims. I mean, I think when people talk rightly about disappearance in Northern Ireland, appalling suffering for people related to those who had disappeared, unspeakable suffering, and ostracism socially, and it's just a terrible thing. When you multiply that by the numbers you're talking about, Brad, there's this kind of, oh my goodness, the scale of that is, and that's quite important for people in Northern Ireland to think about as well, because it gives a context to some of those things.
Yeah, thank you. It's just fascinating stuff, and I'm really interested in the historical debate. Not just that everything has a history, but the question, what is history itself, seems really relevant to then answer questions like what is terrorism. So there is a question here, which is to ask you to say a bit more about your understanding of history. Because, I mean, the question, what is history, I think it's an E.H. Carr question, isn't it? But also, I think Richard Jenkins wrote the book against the kind of postmodernist view of history, which is it's just pure contingency. I always like Henry Ford's description of history, it's just one damn thing after another. You know, when we come to understand terrorism, we're kind of guard against that. And I think the idea of conjuncture gets at that a little bit, because it's both historical, as in not inevitable, but also it is a bringing together of processes, which I think is essential when you study terrorism. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, then what is terrorism is it's just pure contingency, which means it's irrational and can't be explained, and therefore you just say they're evil deeds. So what is history seems to have a real relevance here that you are starting to draw out, I think, at the beginning.
Thank you. So, okay, those are great questions too. So I'll try and address both the what is history and the what is terrorism and organically link them if I can. On history, my approach to that, I mean, what are the things that an historical approach distinctively brings? It seems to me that there's an assessment of continuity and change over long pasts and long futures. There's a sense of the complex particularity and ultimately the uniqueness of each context as the basis for comparison, not its enemy. There's an attention to getting a vast number of mutually interrogatory sources, including first-hand sources. A lot of what's written about terrorism is written without really people listening to what people involved have said that much, so historians would look at that. I think there's an emphasis on contingency, not inevitability, and I think there's a skepticism about mechanistic theories of explanation and procrastinating theories. If you put all those together, I think there's something which is a uniquely historical way. It doesn't mean it's better than philosophers or better than sociologists or better than mathematicians or any other discipline. All disciplines are equally precious, but there is an historical cast of mind which seems to me to bring those things together. The practical implications of that, I think, can be detonating. So some people have heard me say this before, but I don't know of any really good historian of Iraq who thought that what was expected in 2003 with the mission was likely to happen. Doesn't mean the invasion was necessarily wrong, but it's a big question mark. The what is terrorism, partly, if you're going to look at it through those lenses, you're then saying, well, the really important thing about terrorism is the things that cause it, not the thing itself. So you're looking in Israel, I mean, with Israel-Palestine, seems to me you're looking at entirely explicable but seemingly mutually cancelling religiously fueled nationalisms in a precious territory with a history which also has regional engagements which often make it worse. That's the real thing that's happening, that the murders by Hamas and the suffering of Gazans at the moment are unspeakable. But we shouldn't be blinded by the what's happening without looking at the thing. And I think a historical approach to that probably means that we have to have a humility about how long it's going to take to get anything to go better. But I think it's also important to think, historians will always tend to think, what are the really big transformations here, of which the violence is a kind of deceptively eye-catching symptom. One of the paradoxes of terrorism is everyone talks about the terrorism, not about the thing which is supposedly causing it. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, I don't want to dissuade you from buying my book, Does Terrorism Work? But I'm going to give you the answer, which is strategically it overwhelmingly tends not to, but it does tend to get other things, so secondary goals of revenge and publicity. But the paradox of terrorist publicity is people see the bomb and the terrible thing that happened. They don't see the backdrop to it. So even with some of the better journalists in recent weeks, if you'd never read a book about Hamas, you'd be slightly in the dark about why this atrocity happened. I think all Hamas violence is unspeakably unjustifiable, but I think it's explicable. And I think you've got to explain these things in the way with any violence. So putting the two together, there's a particular historical method, but also it seems to me with terrorism, it's really history will say it's not that the terrorism is the symptom. Even with something atrocious like 9/11, it's the other things that cause it which are the really big things to study, is my view. Not a popular thing to say, particularly in the wake of atrocities. I think that's part of the value of an historically minded approach to these things. Difficulty with it is, though, if you were trying to get elected, there's no point saying, think about the long and entangled history of the Middle East and think about the next 50 years. People say, I want to get elected now. You know, if I want to get elected now, I've got to do this. And I totally understand that. I mean, we've discussed this before, Brad, that, you know, after 9/11, while much that went wrong in counterterrorism had deleterious effects for many of us across the world, if you were trying to get re-elected as President of the United States, being a war president might predictably give you some rewards.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there can be more going on in dealing with terrorism than just dealing with terrorism.
It's interesting, it reminds me when you're speaking actually, the article Simon Critchley wrote in the New York Times on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 called The Cycle of Revenge. I'm thinking about the cycle of revenge today. And he said, what would it have meant? Because George Bush famously said Jesus Christ was his favourite philosopher. And he said, what happens if George Bush would have exercised the politics of forgiveness after 9/11 to try to break the cycle of violence? And of course, we know this is impossible for political leaders. They cannot say, no, let's end the violence. Right? In the first to make that call, because it makes them unelectable. And I think that reveals something about our own politics.
It does, and yet, as you imply, one of the big motivations for people engaging in non-state terroristic violence is revenge for something which has been done against your community in the first. There's an escalatory mutual cycle of revenge. And so actually taking away those things which seem to give some impetus to revenge is one of the ways of being life-saving. But, you know, that's not, you know, in the current climate, if you're in power in Israel, that's a near impossible thing to say. For Jews, clearly, Jesus' teaching are a different thing than for Christians. But I mean, actually, the extraordinary teachings of Christ, if you're looking at it from the American politicians, you know, one of the differences between Britain and America is in Britain, if you have a prime minister who does believe in God, they pretend they don't want to talk about it. Whereas in America, if you want to be president, even if you don't believe in God, you pretend you do. It's kind of it's the opposite. But I mean, you know, if you were to take seriously the things which Jesus is known to have said, actually, a lot of that would be very helpful with counterterrorism. You know, it really would. But I think that it's more difficult to get in the heat of vengeful violence and responses to it. It's very difficult to get those teachings to be appropriated. George W. Bush seems a more statesman-like president through the lenses of knowing some of the people who came after him. But I mean, I think he's not to be underrated, but Bush was never a clown. I always thought the notion that Bush was clownish was entirely wrong. He was a very, very savvy politician. But I think that, you know, if you don't want cycles of violence to keep happening, then giving reasons for seeming justifications for revenge is something which you need to be very cautious about.
Does anybody have another question? Yeah. Go.
About gender and in relation to terrorism. Mary Day talks about the Trinity, the unholy Trinity of war, rape, and genocide, and how she links it explicitly to religion, and how it's a result of male domination and patriarchy. And I was wondering, how far do you feel that terrorism fits into this as kind of like a fourth expression of male-centric violence and conflict?
That's a really complicated question, so I'll do my best to answer it, but I'm not sure I can give you a good answer, but I'll give you an honest answer. As with so much violence which humans practice against each other, practitioners tend disproportionately to be male, and some of the people who are most invisible are female. So there is that appalling injustice. I'm not sure how far that is to do with religion, in the sense that I think whether religious or secular, humans have a capacity to reproduce some of those models. So I think in some ways it seems to me that it's about power and the capacity to be unempathically powerful and brutal, rather than about particular ideologies that express it. One of the benefits of looking more than scholars of terrorism have perhaps tended to do in the past at victims' voices and listening to victims' voices would be to give slightly more of a balance to the experiences. So there's been far more research engaging with terrorist combatants' voices than with victims' voices, and the combatants' voices do tend disproportionately to be male. So there's a reproduction of some of that privileging there. But broadly, our record on equality here is shocking. So you're talking about digital stuff. I mean, the abuse that all politicians receive now is ghastly, but far, far worse for women than for men. Right, and so I think there are ways in which this is something we just constantly need to address. In the literature on terrorism, there have been some extraordinarily powerful female scholars. I mean, Martha Crenshaw would be one, Louise Richardson would be another. There's a series of brilliant scholars who worked on it. The more it got to being that there were as many books by female scholars as by men, the better it would all be for all of us in all sorts of ways. But I do think that shifting to listening to the people who are on the receiving end, including trying to, if you uncover the lives of the disappeared, you've got something which will redress some of that imbalance. I think they're reclaiming those silences in history are so important, and they do tend to reinforce power imbalances. That can be geographical, that could be racial, that could be to do with social class. It can certainly be to do with gender. And I mean, I'm instinctively an egalitarian. I think that I don't see why one life is less precious than another, or one voice should be heard less than another.
I was also thinking about Beverly Milton Edwards' work on Hamas as well, which was
Yeah, former colleague of mine. Indeed, yeah.
Roddy?
Richard, thanks. Great to see you. That was really interesting. You've spoken about the importance, of course, of corruption with the past and all that. The Good Friday Agreement, they had weapons and so on, power sharing agreements. But you also mentioned it's a southern piece.
Yeah.
So kind of an idea of peacelessness in Northern Ireland, which is kind of characterised as you and I have spoken about in the past. Ongoing presence of armed groups, severe, acute societal divisions, tit-for-tat violence very often. And I wanted to ask you as a historian, do you see that as a legacy or do you see it as a continuity? I think back at the context of Latin America that I know a little bit about. And for me, in a place like Guatemala, you can't talk about a legacy in the context of the post-genocide moment, because it's far more continuity. So how would you define that, and what does that mean, if you like, for questions of reconciliation?
So I think it's a great point, Roddy. The continuities between a violently expressed conflict and much less violently expressed conflict are very, very profound. And I think also you don't know when you're between periods of conflict as well. That's the other thing. At the moment, I don't see the basis for a return to serious levels of violence in Northern Ireland. But then if we'd been having this conversation in 1963, people wouldn't have foreseen that you were about to have a 50-year civil war. So you don't know what contingencies will change. In terms of is it legacy of a conflict, or is it still the conflict that's going on? It's a less violent conflict. It's about the legitimacy of the state. It's about inheritances of power. It's about identity, and those things are still ongoing and utterly divided. And I don't see that eroding. The historian's answer is it's going to take a very, very long time, if ever, for that to become something different. And also, we're a self-segmenting species. We like to divide. We like to say, this music's yours, that music's mine. This football shirt's yours, this football shirt's mine. Getting Belfast to be more like Glasgow is a huge achievement. You basically know who you're related to, but it's not machine gun murderous. Huge achievement. Always struck me as a massive response. If you could get Belfast to be like Glasgow, I actually think Belfast's a lot safer than Glasgow now. I always think that, having studied the IRA for years, I'll die in Glasgow. Do you know what I mean? I think this is my, historians shouldn't make predictions, but my prediction is I'll die in Glasgow. I'll be in the wrong boozer and someone will, but I think that it's a massive change to get a sullen peace. It's a huge result because it's at least peace. I suppose I think that the more I read neuroscience, the more I realise that children growing up in these kinds of conflicts, physically what happens to your brain is changed, right? So the transgenerational trauma and conflict is something which goes on and on and on and on and on. And in the Northern Ireland case, that's something which is a horrific legacy. Not as horrific on scale as some of the others that you're describing, Roddy, but still it humbles us about what we can achieve. I mean, I suppose Jonathan Powell, the chief negotiator for the British side in the peace negotiations, his thing was, look, if we can stop the bombs going off and people being murdered, top result. And actually, he's right. Probably in the peace process, probably 2,500 lives now have been saved. Many times that in terms of people maimed, many times that in terms of people who would have been traumatized by things. That's a huge investment in the future, right? So I think it is an achievement. Personally, we've discussed this when we worked together in St Andrews, we've discussed it elsewhere. I like the idea that if you disagree with someone, it can still be an amiable, consensual thing. But we're not good at that as a species, like football, and I think different bits of cities, any American city that I know, and I love US cities, but any sizable city is multiply divided, right? So we're not good at saying we're all part of the same thing. I think there are good explanations for that, but they're not pretty. The big thing about Northern Ireland also, which people don't talk about as much, but which I know there are people in the room who know this, is that the famous division is between the different flags of identity, nationalist and unionist, British or Irish. But the really big division in terms of human life experience is social class. So, broadly speaking, if you want to look at, education, wealth, health, yada, 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 it's the social class is the big division, and the flags less so. But the flags have a way of eclipsing that. And that's true in the peace process. The peace process has been much, 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 much better for you if you're middle class, much less so if you're from a socially disadvantaged community. And so that's going back to the question about geography, we're not very good at this either. The UK is a fantastically wealthy and privileged country. Is it getting fairer? I'm leaving that one quiet, but I think the answer is one we know. United States of America, the best empire by a long way we're ever going to have, enormously wealthy. How fair? So I think there are ways, even privileged and wonderful countries that have the joy of being liberal democratic countries, we can live comfortably with all sorts of inequity.
Yeah.
Nice to see you back in Bristol, Richard, and I was interested in your comments about Glasgow and Belfast. Be careful when you go out and back to your hotel. It is Halloween, and I've already seen you coming on the bus down here. It's quite lively out there. Just to put it in perspective, both Bristol clubs have sacked their managers in the last week, so there's another job going down here. The question I'd like to ask you is, you said we have to put all terrorists into their historical perspective. They are motivated by issues which probably date back generations. In the Irish case, the Irish have got very long members for 400 or 500 years, and more recently other places. So if you become terrorists, you're motivated by revenge or some sort of violent reaction. How much of the mentality of a terrorist is motivated by the chance of success? And how many terrorists have terrorist organisations have actually been successful in the long term? I think that's in South Africa, maybe the case. I don't know whether that's very troubled at the moment. Do the terrorists really think that what they do is anything other than violent and revenge?
It's a great and difficult question. I think it'll vary, like individual to individual, stage to stage, and so on. I think the terrorist organisations that we tend to pay attention to, which are the durable, serious ones, tend to have a strategic sense that they are going to achieve something, but overwhelmingly they don't. So I would say, different estimates are given by different people, but in terms of getting your central strategic goals, well below 10%, and probably smaller than that. Okay, you can pick examples. It's a controversial one, but Jewish terrorism against the British in Palestine accelerated at least the establishment of the State of Israel. The FLN in Algeria, I think you could make a case. You could make a case for the terrorism used by the Taliban between 2001 and 2021 now. I think there are cases. Far more common is not getting strategic success, which is where your point about revenge comes back, because there can be things where you get what I would call secondary goals, like the sustenance of resistance, the sense of moving from humiliating deference to proud defiance, which I think is partly what Palestinian violence has been about. Vengeance, so Hamas, I don't think, ever had the slightest chance of destroying the State of Israel and establishing an Islamic Palestinian state across Mandate territory, but they did have a way of getting revenge on Jews. So those other goals. And I think for various people, it varies. Different people in the organisation will have different roles, and some of them might be more the kinetic violent bit, some more the strategic bit. But my sense is that one of the big lessons of behind your question, one of the big lessons about it, I think, is that if you're looking to produce major societal change, this is not the way it's going to happen strategically. I mean, actually, I think civil resistance is far more likely to have an efficacious outcome than violence. And I would say, Steve, I think that non-state terrorist violence far more certain to produce horrific human suffering than to produce benign major political change historically. I think that's a big conception for us. I also think it's something where we therefore, when we react to it, should be less concerned with, are they going to win? You know, politicians quite often say when there's a wave of terrorist attacks, this is an existential threat. You know, even an intelligent prime minister like David Cameron, you know, described ISIS, it's an existential threat to the UK. Clearly not true, and he recoiled from it later on. But there's a sense of exaggerating the degree to which it's going to change the world in their ways. What it will do is produce revenge. What it will do is produce violence against often defenseless people. What it will do is seize publicity for things that people normally find repellent. So I think the answer is, I don't think it does achieve that success. I think the more serious leaders do think it will, and they tend to think that it's either the best or most likely way of achieving necessary change, whether it's for Palestinian people or Basque people or for Colombians. But overwhelmingly, states are pretty enduring. I mean, the paradox of it is that the terrorist logic is the longer the violence goes on, the more unbearable it'll be for the state. They'll give us what we want. It's almost the opposite. So the longer it goes on, the more the state can contain it. People get used to it. You know, when the IRA campaign was happening and there were bombs in London initially, there's a bomb in London. Second, then after a while, my tube train's delayed. You know, there was a sort of way in which it became boring. It was very difficult to get the publicity. And in that sense, it's probably an ineffective method strategically. However, tactically, eye-catching it could be. I mean, in terms of strategy at the moment, what conceivable benefits strategically for the Palestinian people can that attack have been? You know, did it gain revenge? Absolutely. Is it partly about rivalry between different wings of Palestinian nationalism? Yes. Are they hoping Israel will then do things which mean that Israel is self-undermining? Yeah, and you can predict that. But strategically, I don't see it as being likely to be effective. And I'll take your tip about Bristol. I'll change my prediction. I'll die in Bristol. I'll die in Bristol.
Yeah, so I'm a bit mindful of time, and I also give space at the end for people to have obviously a broader conversation, a more relaxed conversation. So I'll take one more question from Josephina. And then
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, for this wonderful talk. I wanted to go back to something very simple, which was the title of the exhibition, which is Living with Disappearance.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how do you see the parallels with living with terrorism? Because in a way, when we look at maybe even 17 disappeared or 100,000 disappeared, I think that disappearance always gives us this sense of, yes, the search for the disappeared is worth it, but we might never really find, for example, people who were forcibly disappeared. So I don't think that that's a similar reaction that we tend to have in the face of terrorism. I think very seldomly we say we're living with terrorism. That's it. And the second point that I think is very interesting, we were speaking about creating this container for the voices of the victims. I think that if I look at transnational victims movements, I find a lot of solidarity and work together and lessons learned of victims groups who disappeared, right? Not only Latin America, but also the exchanges we've had in disappearance between Europe and Latin America is really incredible. Does that also happen? Have you seen transnational movements and victims of terrorism getting together and also kind of like putting their minds together to see how they deal with the grief or etc.?
So I'll take that one first, Josefina. Yes, there has been. It's not gone as far as I think it will go, but I think it is something where it has given voice, and it's given voice which has been an important counterweight to some of the narratives around conflicts which have otherwise dominated. But I think more could develop. The living with disappearance, I mean, a couple of points on that. First, living with it is partly being honest about it and unveiling and seeing and listening and just registering. I mean, Brad's made the point that disappearance has not been studied as much as, given the scale and horror, we would think it should be. So partly it's seeing and registering and reflecting. I mean, these extraordinary paintings are a way of registering aspects of response. In one of my books on terrorism, I make the point that really pretending you're going to get rid of it is a totally unrealistic policy, and learning to live with it is the thing. And we don't expect the medical profession to get rid of all ill health. We don't expect the police to get rid of all possibility of burglary. But there's a kind of zero tolerance for anything with terrorism, partly because of the transgressive nature of its eye-catching awfulness. But that makes things much more difficult, because you get these ridiculous politicians' statements saying, we will get rid of X, Y, and Z. And therefore you give, going back to Steve Ryan's question, you give a gift to terrorists, because all they have to do to gain a kind of victory is still to be there when they're out of office. Because you said you get rid of us, well, we're still here. Right? And it is a very long-term thing. The difficulty there, as a former Home Secretary of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland said to me after I gave a lecture, he said, you're probably right, Professor, but I couldn't say that. Because if the Home Secretary says, actually, you know what, far more people die of car accidents and unhealthy breakfasts, like, then a bomb goes off and someone dies, and they say, you're the one who told me to live with terrorism, look what's happened to my mum, right? And then he loses his job. Or, you know. So there is a kind of political exigency, which means that people have to come out and say implausible things. But I don't think that helps us. You know, a lot of implausible, you know, these people have no political support, probably not true. They're all psychopaths, probably not true. We will never give up until we've caught them, certainly not true. We will never forget the victims, sadly not true. We will stamp it out and get rid of it, oops, you know. And so I think all of those things are things where I personally think a more honest approach would do us all good. But as you can already tell, I could never get elected. So, you know, I think no one wants someone to say, this is going to be good for the next 50 years. They want to, you know. But even during the Northern Ireland conflict, you know, road traffic accidents and unhealthy breakfasts killed far more people. You know, so, but there's a way in which, you know, I mean, there's been, it seems facetious to say it, but, you know, in the United States, that the chances in the United States of you being killed by terrorism are infinitesimally small. Accidents in the bath, you know, having a car accident with a deer, much more likely statistically. You know, by the time you get to non-terroristic gun death, off the scale. And yet there's a weird way in which terrorism catches the attention, and you spend billions of trillions of dollars to deal with it in ways that maybe, you know, if that money was spent on other things, would there be more misery reduced? I think so. But, you know, do we want, yeah, it's a good question. Do we want politicians who say that? Personally, I do. I'd quite like a politician who said that. But, you know, I don't see many.
Any examples of politicians who have said that, Richard?
So there's an interesting one, which is the former leader of the Labour Party, which rather backs up my point, Tim, in that, you know, actually fellow Arsenal supporting Jeremy Corbyn, you know, said some things which understandably meant he wasn't going to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But some things he said were actually quite realistic. And one of the interesting counterfactuals is, if we had a Prime Minister who said some of these things, how would we all have responded? But, you know, I've got to be careful what I say, because this is being filmed, isn't it? But I would say that...
We can edit. I'll show you the final edit before it goes out. It's okay.
You know, whatever the merits of some of the things that he said, there was virtually no chance he was going to get elected in the UK as the Prime Minister. And it meant that a mendacious opportunist got a massive majority. Right? And I think that an interesting example, the Norwegian response to the Anders Breivik massacre was a very measured and proportional and democratic response. The test there would be, if it had been Mohammed Breivik, not Anders Breivik, would it have been exactly the same? And I don't think it would, because it's a different reaction sometimes when you exoticize the terrorism. But I think the Norwegian response is very dignified to that terrible, terrible atrocity. But it's a sadly repetitive thing, Tim, that you tend to get the same mantra coming out again and again. And I find, you know, politicians, you know, they want to get re-elected, they want to keep their job, I understand that. Military and police are often really sound on this one. Actually, they'll say, you know, because they're put in the front line and blamed for stuff, and they say, actually, we know this isn't, you know, people are exaggerating what we can do with the army. And I don't want to berate the entire political class. It's an incredibly difficult job and a quite crucial one. But I personally, I'd rather have more politicians who admit that they made a mistake. Personally, I'd have more politicians who admit that they think long term. But you know, there ain't many to vote for, sadly. And interestingly, it's also becoming. We were talking about change over time, and the digitalisation plays a part in this. I think that. I remember when I was a kid here, going here, and Tony Benn coming doing a couple of gigs, right? And whether you agreed with him, which I at that stage did on a lot of things or not, he was a believer in the same way that Margaret Thatcher was. Actually, interestingly, they were believers, and part of the reason I think Corbyn got that initial Glastonbury rush of enthusiasm was people thought, at least there's a bloke who believes in something. The difficulty was he hadn't changed his mind on anything since he was about 17, and so therefore it was no chance of him getting the job. But I think there was a way in which it was an old-style politics. Now, I never voted for Mrs. Thatcher. I thought her politics were repellent, but she was she's far more able than most of the people in the current cabinet, right? And B, she believed in stuff. And I think there is something about that's become more difficult now because, you know, if you look at the current Labour Party, which I think the Tories will lose the next election rather than Labour winning it, but I think he'll get the job. But Keir is desperate just not to say anything that makes it more difficult for them to win seats. That's the game. And electorally, he's right, but that's slightly dismal. No, I don't mean Keir's dismal. I mean that's dismal because it means that it's about not saying something which tweets you out of getting elected in Stoke-on-Trent with your MPs and so on. But that's where we've got to, I think. It's part of the weird reason that Trump was so popular as well, because although I think Trump probably doesn't believe in anything at all apart from himself, he sounded different from the elite politicians. He sounded like he wasn't one of the dynasty. There was a sort of bizarre resonance. I shouldn't finish with Nigel Farage, but I'm going to, which is that kind of, in his case, I think, fake, you know, I'm your regular guy in the pub thing. He's brilliant at that. He's absolutely brilliant at that. I mean, actually, someone less like the geezer in the pub in Stoke than Nigel Farage is hard to imagine. And yet, what a brilliant act he did. And I think that sort of politics is interesting because it cuts across some of these things we're discussing. But to go back to the question, are there politicians who are saying the things I'm going to say? I mean, no, they'd never get the job, is my sense. Another question?
It's really interesting, the Breivik example.
Yeah, it is.
I also thought about Timothy McVeigh.
Mm-hmm.
Is far-right terrorism different in terms of how it's treated, certainly in Western?
That's a really great question. So in the United States of America, there's a turn now towards saying, actually, this is the thing. Right? And the way the craftier people in the agencies are getting around it is to say, we call terrorism terrorism if it's international terrorism. But actually, this is international terrorism. Look on their websites. Right? And if you do it that way, it's far more violent, okay, far more dangerous. And in the current volatility of the United States of America, it's also very worrying because you have this vociferous tendency where you can go into a shop and buy these appalling weapons, as I see appalling weapons. But we tend to find it easier, I think, to call it terrorism if it's not mainstream heritage. So in England, for example, Irish terrorism was seen as being something somewhat exotic, although there are many Irish people who live in England. Jihadist terrorism was seen as exotic, even though many of the people involved were English people. Whereas far-right terrorism is, in the States, is, the guy with the bottle of Jack Daniels who's like the bloke down the road, and so it seems like it, but if it's terrorism, it's terrorism. And it seems to me in the United States, it's far more difficult. The Capitol attack was an interesting wake-up call there, I think, because had it been organised properly, it was a coup, a proper coup. Now you're getting shelves of books written about is America on the verge of a civil war and so on. And it is a serious challenge. My view is I don't care whether people have got my politics or not, whether they look and sound like me or not. If you're using callous, deliberately terrorising violence against people, it's not a good thing, and it's going to make the world worse for them and probably for me too. And I don't want it to happen. I don't care whether it's in an African country. I don't care whether it's in Israel, Palestine. I don't care whether it's an Israeli or a Palestinian. That's the humanity involved in our response is what's really important to me. But I mean, I when I was at St Andrews, I invited a climate change scientist to come and do a talk. And were you there when Chris Rapley did his talk? And he gave this unbelievably bleak. Just seriously bleak. Because I was trying to get us to think about risk, risk and terrorism, risk and climate change. And at the end of it, I said, Chris, you know, these examples you're giving are so awful. Sounds like it's all over. And he said, basically, he said, I kind of think it is, but I still think I should do what I can. And he said, I describe myself as an activist fatalist. And I thought, this is me. This is me. I'm an activist fatalist. Yeah, I know no one's going to listen to my books, but I still think I should do what I can.
Well,
on that bleak note.
Yeah, on that bleak note, I'd like to obviously thank Richard. The gallery will be open till 8 o'clock, so I'll invite you to stay around. We can have a talk furthermore, you know, informally, speak to one another, speak to Richard, myself, other great academics in the room, speak to the artist as well if you want. But at least join me for now in thanking Richard once again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.